We've got the melting pot, and then we'll have the meltdown. Then we'll finish the conference right on time, but then we finish with chill and crystallize, where we'll have picnic blankets outside, as you know, and so there'll be some nibbles provided, but you could go and get your own drinks from the bar, or they might even come out and take orders, for all I know. Where's Lee? We'll find out if they'll take orders. Oh. Are you shouting, Chad? Thanks. So for our panel, we formed this panel. We're trying to look at something that is a real contemporary issue around inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, research-based learning, discovery learning, problem-solving, evidence-based decision-making. As we've seen in this conference, there is a lot of overlap. And one of the evaluation questions in the survey is what you personally perceive to be the level of overlap. Maybe it's a really large and high extent of overlap between them, so they're very similar, or actually they're quite different, so there's just a small amount of overlap. But obviously at this conference, by using a shared framework, we try to look at what is the conceptual connections, so there's not all these individual bits and pieces. What we haven't really emphasised in this conference is something this panel is for. It's to really emphasise that dimension of autonomy in the framework. Now, some of the frameworks, that's very explicit, the work skill development framework, the clinical reasoning framework, some of your frameworks, the original RSD. It's very explicit. And some of them, it's left implicit, like the optimising problem-solving Pentagon, and most of the Pentagon versions, it's left implicit. And that's fine, because as long as we take consideration of that dimension for students, it doesn't mean that you have to make that dimension explicit. You don't have to talk about autonomy of students, or do you? So, if students become more autonomous, how much do they have to realise what does it mean to become an independent learner, if you phrase it like that? Do they have to know more about, so do some of the frameworks have to spend more time thinking about the explicit nature of autonomy, or not? No, maybe it's just better left implicit, sometimes, all the time. So, the title from Gina Whisker in the UK, Frameworks and Freedoms. And then for this panel, Educator Guidance, Student Ownership, and Learning Tensions. And we want to use this time to really unpack some of those tensions. And we're really interested in diverse perspectives. We're not trying to come to a consensus. This is not a consensus attempt. It's more the opposite. It's actually trying to unpack what is the legitimate and different perspectives amongst a broad, international, interdisciplinary, and many disciplines, many different sectors, a bit of primary, secondary, tertiary, TAFE, higher education. What are the differences in opinion? So we're not really interested in you trying to represent anyone else. We're really interested in you representing your own perspectives around these learning tensions, about the use of frameworks or the maximising of freedoms. So we've asked the panel to form. So you all know Sylvia Tiala from University of Wisconsin-Stout, but I think let's welcome Sylvia again to this afternoon's panel. You all know Jito Vanualele from University of South Pacific. And you all know Mick Healy from the UK, higher education consultant. But we've also, as you heard this morning, we've also got Siddharth Shah. So he's an undergraduate student who's just on the verge. Next year you complete the double degree, which you'll tell us a bit about, no doubt, Sid. And we've also got Ha from our School of Education, University of Adelaide, so both. And they're going, Ha's obviously doing in the higher degree by research space. So we're just going to ask Sid to introduce himself a bit first, and a little bit of his teaching context, and just for about 2 minutes, and then Ha will introduce herself.
Hi everyone. Actually, I've just finished both my degrees, so I did mechanical engineering and finance, and just finished a few weeks ago. My role has been as a descendant or a inheritor of the Ops Pentagon. So the tutors before me were the original creators of optimizing problem solving. And I was a tutor that wasn't taught with it, but started to bring it into workshops when I became a tutor. Although it's been broadened during this conference, my view is very narrow. So from a mechanical engineering perspective and frameworks in the context of problem solving specifically, but perhaps that's why I'm here, because it's a narrow view, so you get one side of it. I would also say it's quite naive, both as a student and as a teacher. So maybe that's also why I'm here. So I would consider myself as more of a independently conscious student rather than tutor. So more reflective as a student. But as a tutor, it's only really when I'm in discussions like this or in discussions with other tutors or lecturers that I'm prompted to reflect. So that's a little bit about my perspective.
Great, thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is Ha, I'm from Vietnam. I used to be a teacher at tertiary level in Vietnam before I came here to carry on with my PhD study. My interest is on the impacts of classroom assessment practices on the development of learner autonomy, especially in higher education context in my country. And I'm still struggling with autonomy aspects in my project, to be honest. And I see some of the relevance in the ISD in conceptualizing all the practices and the level of autonomy in my context, but I'm still working on this kind of framework. Yes. That's all.
Right, thanks. So you might just have a general question, or you might target your question to someone in the panel. That's up to you.
Where I work, people don't tend to think they do research. So in the content of being restrictive, could the use of the word research in the RSD framework be a barrier to the understanding of undergraduate students? So anyone's welcome to answer.
No? Yeah, I'm on now, yes. You probably won't believe anything I'm saying now if you saw me on the dance floor last night. So don't take me seriously. I've done lots of workshops over the years on sort of research-teaching relationships, and two things happen. One is the elephant in the room is what do we mean by the term research, and that's been unpacked a number of times here. And the other thing, I'm pretty pragmatic. Depending where I am, I'll change my language. So if I'm in a community college, I think you're coming from that sort of context, I will probably just use the word inquiry. And sometimes I think the word research could be banned from the literature for a couple of years. It causes so much confusion that we might actually move forward in some of our debates.
Sylvia.
So the short answer to that is yes. And the longer answer is, at least for me, when I deal with K-12 teachers or even with pre-service teachers, particularly in career and technical education contexts, the word research, they will tell you right off the bat they do not do that. But if I start talking to them about, are you interested in engaging your learners and making your teaching engaging, they will say yes. And then I can bring out the models of engaged learning and teaching, which is the RSD, and start talking to them about how to engage their learners, and it's much less threatening for them.
I'm interested in the context of Sid because he's in engineering.
I think practically from a student perspective, I've been grappling with the connotations of the word and the weight of the word choice. I can see that with a lot of implementations of these frameworks, there's very specific and deliberate word choice. And I've been thinking about whether that has the impacts that we want them to have, or whether it's just, whether it has a material impact. I think with research in the title research skills development, From a student perspective, it might almost seem like be the equivalent of a brand name and not necessarily change how it's perceived. I think personally, if it was like called something else, I would still treat the framework for what it is and not be too caught up on the connotation of the word. But I think the wording within it, like of each of the elements, what I've sort of settled to is it's not consistent. Like for some students, it'll have the connotations that we're after, and for some students it won't.
Thanks, Ken. So now, because we're after an interactive session, they might throw up issues or questions to you. We don't have to go through these questions in sequence. So would anyone like to throw out a comment or a question? It's not just all about the panel being experts, we're also drawing on your expertise. So any other, please jump in. Oh, we need a microphone.
My question is to the students and panel members. When I first started teaching, my colleagues always say, when you create your syllabus, you don't give choices to students. You mess up your everything. So I didn't take this because I'm teaching, I'm teaching service innovation. I also still try to give students options so they can choose among different things. But technically, I did face some of the challenge because some students use this as something to attack or maybe challenge the instructor about, for example, the fairness. We're doing different things. How are you going to grade us fairly? So such type of thing. So from a student perspective, do you really want choices? And when you are facing a situation that is you feel is unfair or in a disadvantaged situation, I'm going to use this as a excuse to maybe attack your instructors. So, yeah.
I myself think that as a student, I think the key point here is the personal relevance. That what I think relevance to my own personal purpose or personal interest in what you are designing. So if there's the link or the match between our personal relevance, our personal needs and what you are designing or something, so that's what the things that then can link that what you are doing and what we are expecting, we are as a student expecting from you. So I think the personal relevance is the key thing to from my own experience. Thank you.
I think I can understand both sides of it. For myself, absolutely, I want choice. That's where intrinsic motivation comes from. I remember in some of my high school subjects, we had like the core content, and in the last two topics, we had a selection, and it was completely open to the class or even individuals what topics we would study. But at the same time, I can see how, like, if you listen to student discussions, it'll always be about, oh, which one's the easiest? Which one can I get the marks out of? Whether it's topics within a subject or picking electives, there's always going to be that element. So I think, like, unfairness and fairness also ties into, how can I get the most marks, get the best GPA? Yeah.
And I wonder from an institutional-wide perspective, Gito, like, what do you think from trying to implement something that's got some consistency over a huge area, a large number of students? What do you think is the role of student choice in your sort of institution-wide initiative?
Well, thank you, John. The region is quite peculiar in the sense that we are kind of isolated out there in the oceans. And so, interestingly, or maybe because as a result of that, we tend to move towards a trajectory that is bordering on religious concept. What I'm saying is that, for example, in our situation, the governments, the civil servants, their activities are governed by religious ideas. So when you have a formal meeting, for example, when the parliament is open, or any other meeting, they will have to pray. Now, whether this is right or wrong, but it just happened to be a characteristic of the South Pacific. All our flags, sorry, not flags, the national anthems, in all of the South Pacific Island countries, has the word God in it. It is one of their values. Now, whether we are religious or not, whether we follow God or not, of course, it's a different matter. It's a personal matter. But it seems that our activities, our way of thinking is governed by God, as it were. So, when we look at the RSD, when I try to explain the RSD to our students, I try to use some kind of parallel scenario that seems to be in the Bible. So, if you allow me, let me talk about that. There's this great king in the Bible called King Solomon. He was so wise that he's basically free to use his mind and ideas to decide on the solution of a particular problem. However, one day he was faced with this particular problem given to him by a wonderful Queen Sheba, I think. And she asked him, I've produced you 2 flowers, like this one here. One of them is fake, one of them is a real flower. Which one is real and which one is not? And that is where the critical thinking starts to come in the mind of King Solomon. How would he determine which one is real and which one is not? The RSD is like a bee that guides you to the goal. You have to be guided by the bee that flew to the real flower, and therefore you reach your goal. Without that bee, without that framework, you cannot even decide for yourself which one is truth, which one is not truth. Therefore, in the context of the Pacific Islanders, when I relate this story to them, they immediately accept the RSD as the savior, as it were.
John.
I'm not a student, but I inherited a physiology topic, and the students had choice, and I thought it was a great idea because, again, I think it's about values, it's about personal relevance, and then being able to choose a major assessment based on its value and personal relevance, I think is really important for their learning, and it sort of it improves on what we want to do with the RSD framework. But what I did find was that the assessments that I inherited, because I literally got the topic 2 weeks before it started and not much time to change these things, they weren't of equal value. And as the semester went on and the students submitted their assignments, what I discovered was that the assignments that actually took work, students did really well on. And the assignments that took less effort, the students didn't do well on them. And so I thought, and then there was lots of students talking about unfairness. And, I thought, okay, that's fine. So what I did the next year was, I think it's about being really thoughtful about what your audience of students is. And then if you're going to provide some different alternatives, think about the different values and relevance they're going to have, perhaps by course degree or something like that. And then it helps you to sort of come up with some really viable options. And then students will value them more, and you may include an explanation with each option to say, well, like from my perspective in a class with 39 degree programs, I might have something for medical health, I might have something for education, something for scientist type students, but they're still going to have an underlying melt, a need to undergo the processes involved in melt. So that might be a way of providing some good options and sort of creating that fairness and relevance for students.
Yeah, I was just going to link on the story that Yuta just told us, because one of the things I think has been missing from the sessions today, and John, tell me if I got it wrong, is that there hasn't been anybody actually saying about how do we go about engaging the students with the RAISE models. This is how I do it, and I've got a practical problem. In January, I'm giving a workshop on developing research teaching links with with art and design. And I had a wonderful conversation with Lynn and Barbara at lunchtime when they suggested that if you have a stimulus to start the thing, it's great. And the stimulus they came up for art and design was almost exactly the same story as you had, but in artistic terms. How do you tell if that piece of art is a fraud or not? So it reminded me of that. But I thought it's a way in to discussing about what do we use when we're trying to engage faculty or students in the RSD. How do we run our workshops? I think there's a case for sharing those ideas here, and I'd certainly be interested in people from the audience saying how they do it.
Where's Lynn? Because I'm interested in her perspective on this, because we've been discussing this very issue lately.
So, Mick, are you asking us how we run our workshops? Was that the question? So at Monash Australia and now also Monash Malaysia, we run our RSD workshops in a conceptual way because the RSD is a conceptual tool. So we never tell people how to use it. We unpack the RSD through stimulus activities and we take people right outside of the curriculum. We don't come into the curriculum until about towards the end of the workshop. So that would be probably about 2.5 hours into the workshop. So we use activities around, the stimulus, similar to what Mick just described. We've got a whole raft of different activities depending on the disciplinary area we might be working with. We look at movie clips. What else do we do? We use questions and skill statements that we map to the analysis that we've done of a particular clip or the stimulus activity that we've used. We use one of John's paper folding exercises, the pyramid, where we bring in autonomy and have a discussion about that. And it's not until then that we start to look at the RSD and put all of that unpacking and all of that thinking around skills and autonomy, then looking at assessment task and at curriculum. So that's how we've been doing that for quite some time and it's been quite successful. Barbara, would you like to add anything?
Well, no, not really, except to pick up on Mick's point about running a session on how to introduce the RSD or how to get people to engage with the RSD, especially in that first engagement, because I think that's where you're most likely to lose people, possibly.
What I did with 750 first-year students in a common course in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Adelaide was used it as a kind of a design principle for their group work, their SGDE activity. If you're from Adelaide, you'll know what that means, hopefully. But the way I didn't really... Their first years, it's their first year, first semester. They're all from all different disciplines, so very diverse. And it's a compulsory course, so they don't want to be there to start with. So I resisted the temptation to go, here's a model, here's a really technical model that we're going to, and working that directly with the model for engagement purposes. But what I did was ran a series, I turned the live lectures into a kind of an interactive session with audience voting mechanisms and things like that. And so there were 12 of them, and I took the 6 facets of the RSD, and each facet was a theme for that week's discussion and activity and things like that. And there was and the idea was to do the 6 and then do it again at a higher level, that kind of iterative, cyclical sort of thing that's central to the models. One of the interesting things that the students fed back was they felt that it was repetitive in the second half. Oh, we've already done Embark and Clarify. Oh, we know how to synthesize and analyze and things like that. This is, get on with it sort of thing. So that was an interesting bit of feedback there. Does that answer what you were getting at a bit? Yeah.
Any other further suggestions, ideas, practice, things you've done?
Okay, so my question was around starting from the point of autonomy and looking more at that idea of educator guidance in an undergraduate kind of supervised research project type thing. I guess a traditional way of thinking about it is transferring or adapting the kinds of processes and ideas that you have in postgraduate research, in HDR research in particular, into that kind of thing. And that tends to take a very long time and is really resource intensive, particularly in a one-on-one situation. So if we're using that kind of model of extended kind of cultivation of student autonomy that paradigmatically we tend to get from HDR, what are some of maybe the practical or resource implications of that? If you do it for half a dozen students in HDR and suddenly you're doing it for 200 students in third year, how might we manage that kind of quite practical resource implication or workload implications for staff and funding models and things like that? Any ideas? Probably, no, not really. Anybody who thinks they have a response at all, I guess.
So I just got done running 60 students through a 6-week primary and secondary research project. Those 6 weeks that they do that project for me are very time intensive. Some strategy, I intentionally looked at the research skill development framework when I did this. One, make sure that you don't try and concentrate on any other content that you think is related while they do that research project. 2, scaffold it. And I intentionally went to the very far end of, as far to the right on the RSD level of autonomy that I thought I could, which is working in groups of up to 4. Do a research project that incorporates a technology, how it impacts learning, and at least one human being, and that can be yourself. I understand that you are not going to come out at the other end with research that's going to save the world, but I don't care. I care that during this assignment, you demonstrate the thinking process. And you do have a product, but I'm going to evaluate on the process. And during a 6-week period of time, I give them feedback. I let them turn in assignments that are iterative. Nice try in the APA. Let's try that again. Great problem. If 80% of the issue is focusing on a problem statement, if you get that done, the rest will fall in line easily. I like to have them work in groups because that lightens my workload. But then it's, okay, go do it. Now let me see some of your letters. Let me see your the evaluations, and that's where it becomes time intensive for me because I won't let them go do it until they pass. I get to look at their questions, and I have them actually do assignments outside of class and come to class with questions so I can work with them one-on-one. But in 6 weeks, at the end, they do a 5-minute peer-reviewed video presentation, much like going to a conference and present. And they peer review, which takes the workload off of me. Now, I have tons of other things I have graded relative to that project, but the emphasis is I want you to demonstrate you can think. I don't care if your research ends up being awful. I don't care if you don't get any results. I care that you went through the process, and you have to do both primary and secondary research.
And Gito, I was thinking in terms of the question around, pressure on resources and workload, when you've got that institutional level, you're trying to really embed explicit, engaged learning and teaching, research, skill development, and problem solving in the curriculum across every program, right?
Right.
So I wonder your perspective on the pressure on resources and workload from looking at that. We want all students, that's really all students, to have that experience of engaging and learning and teaching through kind of research mode or problem-based learning mode. So, Gito?
Yeah, thank you, John. In fact, the pressure is so huge, actually, on our resources. So we eventually had to create some policies in order to manage the pressure that we are experiencing. The first one is what we call the quality of research policy, where basically we're telling the lecturer that, look, your contract explicitly states that you must do teaching 70% of the time, you must do research 20% of the time, and you must do administration 10% of the time, administrative-related work. So we developed a policy where we actually measure these ways of doing research 70% of the time, then 20% of the time teaching, and research, and 10% of the time of administration. What we found out over the last, in our history of the university, what we found out that even though our staff got this contract, about 50% of them, they actually did not do research, which means that the university is paying them money for which they don't do anything at all. So we zoom in on this particular aspect of 30% of your time and said, look, if you're not doing research, then that bit of 30% of the time, either we take back the money or you actually teach a student. So without extra resources, we look inwards and look at what we can save, as it were. And that's one way of doing that. And really, 50% of our staff that don't do research at all. And the university is paying them this money to do research, but they don't do research. And we found out that within the contract of 3 or 5 years, the majority of our staff, 50 to 60% of them, do not do research at all. So we're converting that into helping out the RSD, implementation of the RSD. And what we're saying now, okay, if you don't do research, then 90% of your time is teaching, part of which you should help now the students to do your research, without getting extra resources, that is. The other thing that we developed was the quality of teaching. So simultaneously, we develop the quality of research, we look into the data, then we are informed by the data, and therefore we can sit down with the staff and say, look, this is how you're performing. Now, because you're not doing any kind of research, we want you to help out the students with the portion that you are paid for to do research. And so the staff now, they can claim that 30% of the time doing research is helping out with students in terms of research, RSD. And that can now be also reflected in the quality of teaching policy, which we developed. Basically, what we're saying in that quality of teaching is that if you adopt some kind of teaching scholarship, some kind of a model of engaged learning, then you will be considered favorably in the, for example, staff review. So with the simultaneous development of both policies, the quality of research and the quality of teaching policy, we basically look inwards and then get the resources from within in order to meet the pressure of the RSD.
And as you know, and we'll get to you, Shaiva, been researching in the Vietnamese English language learning space, the question around autonomy, and it's not all, it doesn't seem like it's even around resources, but how would you interpret that question around resources, but especially around autonomy in English language learning context in Vietnam?
I may share with you some of my, maybe the initial findings that I found from my data collection about learners' autonomy in my context. Something as I expected before I came, because I did collect my data in the context where I used to work before I came here for my study. So as I expected that in the classroom context, not much autonomy was given to the student, and the student didn't take a lot of autonomy within the classroom context. So when I did the interview and the observation in my context, the finding was not something surprising, and that's something that I expected, that the level of autonomy in the class was very kind of low and prescribed to the student. But surprisingly to me, when I interviewed the student about their learning of English outside the class, I found out that the level of autonomy is very high. And the student have their own objective for their English learning outside the class. They have their own way and methods to achieve their goals. They have their own resources outside the class. They have their role models, everything ready that help them to achieve their goal for their English learning. So I'm wondering what makes them more autonomous out of the class, but not inside the classroom context. And maybe it can come back to the term that I mentioned earlier. It's personal relevance, because maybe the student didn't find the classroom learning relevant to their, or can support them to reach their general goals for their English learning. So they have to autonomously find the other way and set their own path to autonomously do something else out of the class to reach their goals. So it's kind of personal relevancies also play a part in this kind of thing. But I'm not 100% sure yet, but that's what I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Ha. And before we get to Shiza, would anyone like to respond to Ha?
So yeah, I actually had a question that aligns with that directly, and it has to do with the two students and those students in the audience, and a way around actually, or towards that specific issue, and how you feel about micro-credentialing. So that's actually giving a student a badge or a credential for an aspect of the RSD framework or any other aspect. And one of the things that you can do if you micro-credential is that you don't actually have to include it in the course. It can actually be external to the course. You just have to display in some way, as you've indicated, in an external demonstration to members of staff that you've actually demonstrated some degree of autonomy, whether it's bronze, silver, or gold, and then you would get a micro-credential. The advantage of that process is students actually, at least an advantage, potential, is that they actually value the content. So I just wanted to know how you would feel about being given a micro-credential so you'd know what you were really good at and what other aspects you were maybe a bit weak in.
So that's what I'm thinking of. Maybe I think because I'm looking at the impacts of classroom assessment practices on the learners, the development of learner autonomy. So I think maybe the teachers can utilize the classroom assessment practices to help the student to have the better overarching views about what the student have at the moment, where they need to go in there, and maybe, but I'm not sure whether it works in my context, because I see a lot of constraints in my context, actually from the different parties, like from the university as well. They have different expectation from the teachers, and so the teacher and student, they work under a lot of different pressures from outside. So yeah, that's ideally what the teacher maybe they expect, the student may expect, but maybe they can't do anything within the context. And I still remember one comment of the teachers, and they told me that, she told me that, I know that autonomy is very important to the student, but it's not my priority at the moment. My priority is now to help the student to pass the exam. It's not to help them to be autonomous at the moment, even though I know that it's very important. So that's what I found, yeah.
No, I'm interested in getting Sid and Mick's perspective on this micro-credentialing issue and autonomy, but I wonder if someone else has something to say first, whether to further answer David's question or to pose something along that line to do with micro-credentialing and autonomy. Is there anything that pops out for you? Ursula, the microphone's coming from that way.
Thank you. Is that on? Yes. Not particularly about micro-credentialing so much as getting back to the point that Sylvie, that you made about product and process, and not so interested in the product as in the process. Now, if we can get that across to students, that the product is important, but it's what we're teaching to is the processes, the skills, the abilities to do things for themselves. And so using perhaps the optimizing, the OPS version of the RSD to focus on the process with the product inside it, so that inside the optimum, what we call it, the OPS framework, so that the students become self-directed learners as part of getting the product. So so I'd like to use the OPS framework for showing them that, and then the autonomy one to see the level of autonomy that they've attained. So I know that diverted a bit from David's, I'm sorry.
Well, let's put that to Sid then, because you know, with the culture of the mechanical engineering tutors developing the OPS Pentagon, and which quite nicely strips out a consideration of autonomy because it's for direct use with students and reflection. So just considering what Ursula said, what do you think is is there any role of making autonomy more explicit at any stage to the first year students, or like to guide them, or what's the role of autonomy with the problem-solving framework?
I think to some extent it doesn't necessarily need to be explicit, because first year is a stage in the degree, and I think it was touching on something Sylvia was saying, it's about scaffolding it. So I think in response to Chad's comment about like reaching autonomy as an end goal, if you don't need to necessarily make it explicit in first year, but introduce limited areas of autonomy, so like things that they are autonomous in, without necessarily making it explicit. I think one thing with first years in particular is to detail some of the pedagogy behind things might be irrelevant to them. They want to know exactly what they're learning and why it's useful in where they want to end up. And I'm a victim of the like product versus process thing. Like I always find myself thinking, oh no, like what about the work I've done rather than the learning I've done, until maybe a few weeks after I actually do it.
Yes, thanks. And Mick, your perspective.
I think this is part of a broader and quite universal discussion we have about skills versus content, and how do we teach skills? Do we teach skills independently of content, or do we teach the content and you gain the skills through the content? And there's no right or wrong answer to that, it's doing both. But one example I came across a few years ago, which I found very powerful, was at McMaster University. And they were teaching a learning how to learn course. Now, we almost all do that in our discipline context. Most of the learning how to learn courses I've seen are you have a different skill being taught each week and you illustrate it with examples from whatever the discipline is you happen to be. But the skills are up front. So, you know, how to work in a group, how to search the library, how to write an article, whatever it happens to be. And at McMaster University, I heard this first in 2005 at an International Society of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning conference. And Christopher Justice, who was making a presentation, talked about an inquiry learning course they did in the first year, where they had students in, each faculty had different courses, and he described the social science one. Each semester they would come up with a different theme for that year. So one year it was, say, social identity, anyway, doesn't matter, a different theme. And in groups of 24 to 30, the students would be divided into groups of 4, and they'd first spend the first couple of weeks coming up with a researchable question. Go back and forth to the instructor, you know, that's too broad, that's too narrow, that's a yes-no answer, until they got a reasonably phrased research question. It comes to your centre of your pentagon in many ways. But then what they did was to say, right, now you've got your research question. We'll do a series of exercises to get your answers to that question. You're not going to do original research, but the next week, find me 5 articles which address that question. And one of the definitions of a researchable question was there was literature out there which existed already. The week after that, there'd be, how do you read an article? It's not a novel, you read an article. Now, having read those articles, make a presentation to the other people in the groups. How do you do a presentation? Week after that might be, how do you write for a different audience? Write a 300-word article for a newspaper. These were all different skills being emphasized each week, but they wouldn't emphasize the skill. They'd emphasize how the student was getting a more understanding of the question they'd come up with, and they put the social capital into that. And then what really amazed me was he used quasi-experimental design to look at students who took this course, which was voluntary, compared with students who didn't take the course. And they found that students who took the course did better subsequently in their next 3 years at McMaster, and whatever the course was, inquiry-based or not. More got mentioned in President's Dispatches. More went on to do an honours degree in that context. And these were statistically significant differences. And, as you know, we rarely find statistically significant differences in educational research. There's so much other noise out there. So I sat up and said, yeah, this is great. I went and looked at the courses. And he did a separate piece of it, because the hypothesis behind it is that the students had learnt more effectively how to learn early on, and therefore were applying that in their subsequent work. And so he actually took some measures of their abilities on how to learn and found the students who took the course were about a year to 18 months ahead of the other students. The others are caught up by the end of the 4th year, but it explains why they were doing better. And I think that's extremely powerful. For me, it's the right order. The research question was at the forefront. The skills were in the background.
Thanks, Mick. Now, we're going to change it up with about 11 minutes to go. I'm going to give you 2 minutes for the audience to think of a burning question. So we're going to get you to talk in 2s or 3s, but I'm going to get the panel to form a circle so you can talk together. And I want you to think of one burning question you can ask the audience around this frameworks and freedom. So you've got 2 minutes to discuss in 2s and 3s, and we'll have to find 1 or 2 burning questions from the whole audience, but come up with your own burning question. It might be a good idea that we actually record them all down, because now that we're almost at the end, but what questions does this raise? We'll be able to address some of them now, but maybe we'll address some later. So 2 minutes for burning questions. We'll get 1 or 2 from the audience and 1 from the panel for you. So be ready. Go. We've got time for 1 question to you from the panel. Kathy Snelling, you'll be the last person to ask a question. Kathy, the panel's going to ask you a question. So, okay, the panel's going to ask you a question. We'll see what sort of answers you might have. Okay, hit us, panel.
I'm sorry, I don't want to dominate the issues about the Pacific region. But basically, I was just telling my colleagues that our system has been the victim of product. Unfortunately, our ministers of education are placing emphasis on examination. So we've got now our students who come to the university who are zombies, using her definition. How do we, but in STEM disciplines, for example, in mathematics and engineering, you need a little bit of rote learning. You need to immediately know the formula of the quadratic formula, for example. You have to know the formula for the attraction between 2 masses immediately. So you need some form of product. How do we balance product and processes? That was the question I put forth to my colleagues. I'm not sure whether it's a valid question or not.
Well, it's a valid question. Yes. Manish is going to tell you. I'll take notes.
Surprisingly, or coincidentally, we were having the similar discussion here. The process versus product. We all are saying that yes, we put an attention and more pressure on process and don't worry about product. But at many places, this is the main problem where the at the end of subject, if a student doesn't pass that subject, he fails. And if he's failing, that means he will not graduate in due amount of time. So we do pay attention to product. We are not looking at process only, but the way I see is if the assessments are made in a way which pays attention to the process, and those assessments are ultimately leading to the product that we are expecting, then that is the best way to go. And all assessments, if they are not focused on the final product, as Sylvia said, and what she has done in her assessments, like she has paid attention to the process. And through the process, ultimately, one is going to get the product. So if you follow the proper process, if you allow students to have their autonomy, take their independence, and they will become the true learner. When we are paying more attention to product, we are enforcing people to get skills. Whereas we pay attention to process, the internal skills that is within the person is flourishing and coming out from within. So it's like bringing out from within or putting that in from outside. That's the difference in that whole of process versus product. And where do we want to start from? Do we want to start from looking at product or process? I don't know if I've answered.
No, well, that's a really good perspective. And this is probably the second and last answer from Xiaoping.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. We also always blame students about they care too much about their grades, about the marks, but we ignore that it's us also. We tend to focus on the student feedback scores, so that is guiding our teaching and development of everything. So I think if you have the courage to focus on, really care about your students, and you want to take some measures that lead to the long-term benefits of the students, this will be something. Because I really get feedback from students right now. Some students who didn't get a good grade, but after, there's one who doing her internship, and she said, when I talk with my general manager, and she's talking about something about the model that I learned from your course, then I just realize the use and the benefits I learned from your course. That is almost a few trimesters later. So for that student, probably I didn't get a 5 for my teaching, but then you have this type of long-term feedback from the students. That's why if we take the courage and then really care about the students, we can maintain this balance of the product and the process.
Fantastic. Thanks, Xiaoping. And I think you could see that that's a great answer to end this session on, because it doesn't matter what frameworks you have or even what extent of freedom. I think it's about care, it's about relationship, and sometimes about risk-taking that we've talked about a bit. And that sort of breathing, you can have all the structure in the world or all the lack of structure in the world, giving high autonomy or low autonomy, but really we're breathing in human relationships. We're kind of, dealing with that kind of level of care and personality. And that's what we don't want to lose in the information age, the online age, is that kind of relationship and care. So thanks very much. And I think we'll just note that you've all generated, which group's generated a question? Who's got a question they've generated? Just put up your hand if you have. We don't have time, because we don't want to go over time. Go to Facebook, and if you're like me and still haven't got onto Facebook, I'm not a user, I'll go to Facebook and put your question on, because that'll be a great way to get the... Where's Fizzer? So will that be a good way to keep the conversations going? Throw your question up there and see what other people say, and look at other people's questions. Maybe the panel could also, get on. And keep the conversation going, driven by questions and need, and make statements, make bold statements. Say what you think. So I think we owe the panel a big round of applause for leading the melting pot. Thank you so much, panel. Most appreciated.